You know that feeling when you look at old photographs and suddenly see your parents in a completely different light? Well, imagine being the daughter of one of Hollywood's biggest legends, a man the whole world loved, and carrying a secret burden for decades that nobody could quite understand. Today, at 63 years old, Melissa Newman is finally opening up about what it was really like growing up as Paul Newman's daughter, and her words are shaking everything we thought we knew about the man behind those famous blue eyes. Paul Newman wasn't just another movie star. He was a kind of actor who made women swoon and men want to be his friend. With his striking looks and that charming smile, he seemed to have it all. But behind the glamorous movie premieres and the racing cars, behind the successful salad dressing company and the charity work, there was a family struggling with something that millions of families face but rarely talk about openly. And now, after years of silence, his daughter Melissa is ready to tell the truth. Growing up in the Newman household was nothing like what people imagined. Sure, there were moments of incredible privilege and excitement. Melissa remembers the fancy parties, the famous friends stopping by, and the way people would stare whenever her father walked into a room. But she also remembers something else, something darker that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. She remembers the tension, the worry, and the pain that came from watching someone you love battle demons that nobody else could see. Melissa was born in 1961, right when her father's career was exploding into superstardom. Paul Newman had already become a household name with movies like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and The Hustler. He was at the peak of his powers, both as an actor and as a heartthrob. But at home, things were complicated. Paul was married to his second wife, Joan Woodward, who was also a talented actress. Together, they were Hollywood royalty, the kind of couple that magazines loved to feature. They seemed to have the perfect marriage, the perfect family, and the perfect life. But Melissa saw something different. She saw a father who was often distant, wrestling with guilt and grief that he couldn't shake off. You see, Paul Newman had been married before Joanne. His first marriage had ended in divorce, and he had 3 children from that relationship. One of those children was his son Scott, and the relationship between Paul and Scott was trouble from the very beginning. When Paul left Scott's mother to be with Joanne, it created a wound that never really healed. Scott struggled with feeling abandoned, and as he grew older, those feelings turned into something much more dangerous. Melissa watched as her father tried to balance 2 families, 2 sets of children, and an ocean of guilt. Paul Newman, the man who could charm anyone on screen, found it incredibly difficult to express his emotions at home. He wasn't the type to sit down and have long heart-to-heart conversations. Instead, he threw himself into his work, into his racing hobby, and later into his food business and charity work. But Melissa could see the pain in his eyes, especially when it came to Scott. Scott Newman was struggling with addiction. Like so many young people in the 1970s, he got caught up in the drug scene. But his addiction wasn't just about rebellion or bad choices. It was tangled up with his feelings about his father, about being the son of a famous man who wasn't always there, about trying to find his own identity in the shadow of someone so successful. Paul tried to help. He really did. But he didn't know how to reach his son. The emotional walls between them were too high, built from years of distance and misunderstanding. And then came the day that changed everything. In November of 1978, Scott Newman died from a drug overdose. He was only 28 years old. The news devastated Paul Newman in ways that most people never saw. In public, he remained composed, the strong, silent type that everyone expected him to be. But at home, Melissa watched her father fall apart. The guilt consumed him. He blamed himself for not being there enough, for not knowing how to save his son, for being too focused on his career and not focused enough on his family. This is what Melissa is finally talking about now. She's speaking openly about the grief that hung over their household like a dark cloud for years after Scott's death. She's talking about how her father changed, how he became quieter, more withdrawn, carrying a sadness that never really left him. Paul Newman lived for another 30 years after Scott died, and in many ways, he spent those 3 decades trying to make amends, trying to find meaning in the tragedy, trying to save other families from experiencing the same pain. That's when Paul Newman did something remarkable. Instead of hiding from his grief or pretending everything was fine, he channeled it into action. In 1980, just 2 years after Scott's death, Paul founded the Scott Newman Center. It was a foundation dedicated to preventing drug abuse through education. He wanted Scott's death to mean something. He wanted to help other kids avoid the same fate. He poured money and energy into this cause, speaking publicly about addiction in a way that was rare for celebrities at that time. But even as Paul was doing this important work, Melissa says he never really forgave himself. That's the part that breaks your heart. Here was a man who gave millions to charity, who used his fame to help countless people, who became known as much for his kindness and generosity as for his acting talent. And yet, he carried this tremendous guilt inside him every single day. He felt like he had failed as a father, and nothing could shake that feeling. Melissa remembers family dinners where the absence of Scott was felt by everyone, even if nobody said his name. She remembers watching her father stare off into space, lost in thoughts that nobody else could reach. She remembers how he threw himself even harder into his work, as if staying busy could somehow ease the pain. Paul Newman became famous for his Newman's Own Food Company, which he started in 1982. He pledged that all profits would go to charity, and over the years, that company has donated hundreds of millions of dollars to good causes. Many people saw this as just a smart business move or a nice gesture from a wealthy celebrity. But Melissa knew the truth. It was a father's way of trying to do good in the world, trying to balance the scales, trying to create something positive out of all that pain. What Melissa is revealing now is how much her father struggled with depression and darkness that he kept hidden from the public. Paul Newman was part of a generation of men who didn't talk about their feelings, who believed that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. He came from a time when you just pushed through pain, when you didn't go to therapy or take medication for depression. You just worked harder and tried not to think about it. But Melissa could see how much he was hurting, and it affected the whole family. She talks about how it impacted her own childhood. Growing up with a father who was physically present but emotionally distant was confusing. On one hand, she had opportunities and experiences that most kids could only dream of. On the other hand, she longed for a deeper connection with her dad, for him to really see her and not be lost in his own grief. She loved him fiercely, but she also felt the weight of his sadness, and sometimes she wondered if she could ever be enough to make him happy. As Melissa got older, she began to understand more about her father's struggle. She realized that his inability to save Scott wasn't just about one tragic event. It was about a man who had been shaped by his own difficult childhood, by his own father who was harsh and critical. Paul Newman grew up trying to prove himself, trying to be good enough, trying to earn love and approval. When he became a father himself, he didn't always know how to break those patterns. He loved his children, but showing that love in ways they could feel was harder for him than playing the most challenging role in any movie. This is what makes Melissa's revelation so powerful and so important. She's not trying to tear down her father's legacy or make him look bad. Instead, she's showing us that even the most successful, most admired people struggle with the same pain and guilt that ordinary families face. She's reminding us that mental health matters, that addiction is a disease that destroys families, and that we need to talk about these things openly instead of hiding them behind closed doors. Melissa also talks about her mother, Joanne Woodward, and how she held the family together during those dark times. Joanne was Paul's rock, his partner in every sense of the word. Their marriage lasted 50 years, until Paul's death in 2008, and it was built on deep love and mutual respect. But it wasn't always easy. Joanne had to deal with Paul's grief and depression, while also managing her own career and raising their children. She had to be strong when Paul couldn't be, and she had to create stability in a household that was often filled with sadness. The story gets even more complex when you understand that Paul Newman tried to make things right with his other children from his first marriage. After Scott's death, he reached out more to his daughters Susan and Stephanie. He tried to repair those relationships and be more present in their lives. But the guilt never left him. He always wondered what would have happened if he had done things differently, if he had been a better father from the start, if he had recognized the signs of Scott's addiction sooner and intervened more aggressively. Melissa wants people to know that her father's pain made him more compassionate, even if it also made him sadder. Paul Newman became known for his incredible generosity and his genuine interest in helping people. He didn't just write checks to charity. He actually cared about making a difference. He would visit the camps for seriously ill children that his foundation supported. He would spend time with kids who were sick, making them laugh and feel special. In many ways, he was trying to be for other children what he felt he hadn't been able to be for his own son. The racing was another thing that people never quite understood. Paul Newman became obsessed with car racing in his 40s, and he was actually really good at it. He competed professionally and won races well into his 70s. Some people thought it was just a midlife crisis or a rich man's hobby, but Melissa says it was more than that. Racing was one of the few places where her father could completely clear his mind. When he was on the track, focused on speed and precision, he wasn't thinking about his failures or his guilt. It was a form of escape, a way to feel alive and present in the moment without the weight of the past crushing down on him. What's really touching about Melissa's story is how she talks about eventually finding forgiveness and understanding. As she became an adult and had her own experiences with loss and disappointment, she began to see her father not as a superhero or a perfect man, but as a flawed human being who did the best he could with what he had. She realized that holding on to anger or disappointment wasn't helping anyone. Instead, she chose to focus on the good memories, on the times when her father did show up, on the lessons he taught her through his actions even when he couldn't express things in words. Paul Newman died in 2008 from lung cancer. He was 83 years old and had lived a full, remarkable life. In his final years, Melissa says he seemed more at peace. He had spent decades doing good work through his charities. He had stayed married to the love of his life. He had maintained his dignity and his principles in an industry that often rewards neither. But she also says that she doesn't think he ever fully let go of the guilt about Scott. It was always there, a quiet sadness in his eyes that never completely went away. Now, at 63, Melissa is sharing these stories because she believes they can help other families. She wants people to know that addiction is not a moral failure. It's a disease that requires treatment and compassion. She wants parents to know that it's okay to ask for help, to go to therapy, to admit when you're struggling. She wants to break down the stigma around mental health, especially for men who are taught from a young age to be strong and silent and never show weakness. She also wants people to understand that having a famous parent doesn't make life easier in the ways you might think. Sure, there are privileges and opportunities, but there's also pressure and expectation and sometimes a distance that comes from living in the public eye. She wants people to see her father as a complete person, someone who did amazing things but also struggled deeply, someone who loved his family but didn't always know how to show it in the ways they needed. The legacy of Paul Newman is complicated, and that's what makes it so human and so beautiful. He was one of the greatest actors of his generation, appearing in unforgettable films like Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, and The Verdict. He was a successful businessman who proved that you could make money and give it all away to good causes. He was a devoted husband who stayed faithful and committed in an industry where marriages rarely last. He was a philanthropist who genuinely cared about making the world better. And he was a father who loved his children but struggled with demons that he couldn't always control. Melissa's decision to speak out now comes from a place of love and healing. She's not trying to shock people or get attention. She's simply telling the truth about what life was really like, and in doing so, she's honoring her father's memory in the most authentic way possible. She's saying that it's okay to be imperfect, that it's okay to struggle, and that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. The conversations she's having now are sparking important discussions about family, addiction, mental health, and the price of fame. People are starting to understand that having money and success doesn't protect you from pain. They are learning that even the most glamorous families deal with tragedy and loss. And they are being reminded that compassion and understanding matter more than judgment. In the end, Melissa Newman's revelations aren't really about tearing away a veil or exposing secrets. They are about humanizing a legend, about reminding us that behind every famous face is a real person with real struggles. Paul Newman was extraordinary in many ways, but he was also just a man trying to do his best in difficult circumstances. He made mistakes. He carried regrets. He lived with pain that he couldn't always express. But he also loved deeply, worked hard to make amends, and left behind a legacy of generosity and kindness that continues to impact lives today. So if you've made it this far in the story, I want you to think about your own life. Think about the people you love and the struggles you don't talk about. Think about the mask we all wear and the pain we hide from the world. Melissa Newman's courage in sharing her family's truth is a gift to all of us. It reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, that even the most successful people face darkness, and that healing comes from honesty and compassion. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own family in a new way, or if it reminded you that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, then do me a favor. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that matter. Stories that go beyond the surface to reveal the real human experiences behind the headlines. Together, we can break down the stigma around mental health and addiction. Together, we can create a world where people feel safe to tell their truth. And together, we can honor the memory of people like Paul Newman and Scott Newman by learning from their story and choosing compassion over judgment. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.